Hey guys, glad to see y'all. It's whenever I'm doing this video, it's May the 4th be with you day. So thought I would do a video. So this is the civil rights movement for us. This is maybe the last video that I do, um, but maybe not. We'll see. So today we're going to start out with the background of the civil rights movement. So stuff that we've talked about already, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. These are the civil rights amendments. First one is slaves are given their freedom with the 13th Amendment. The 14th Amendment was where slaves were given citizenship. They became citizens, and the 15th Amendment gave all men the right to vote. You can see the dates on those right there. Now, let's talk about some laws of the civil rights movement and some court cases that were really, really important, like Plessy versus Ferguson. So this is an 1896 Supreme Court decision that said that segregation is legal as long as facilities were equal, even though we know in reality they were never equal or very rarely equal. And this prompted the passage of these laws called the Jim Crow laws, which were also very much a inequality. So separate but equal. There were examples of these all over the place, and we're talking about in facilities. We're talking about in education. We're talking about in bathrooms and lunch counters and all kinds of different places. So separate but equal. We can see this picture. We can see a white water fountain compared to a colored person water fountain. So we can see they're probably not very equal. So let's move forward a little bit. We're going to jump forward to 1854. This is another 1954, excuse me. This is another Supreme Court case called Brown versus Board of Education. And this was in Topeka, Kansas. And basically what this says is this overthrew that previous Plessy versus Ferguson law court case. And so separate but equal was no longer legal. There could no longer be separate but equal. Everything must be not segregated, or they must be integrated. And so this says, with how fast does this need to happen? With all deliberate speed. Now, that's pretty subjective. What does that really mean? That's a good question. It could mean next week, next month, next year, 10 years, I don't know. And so that was a real problem with this Brown versus Board of Education. So here's one of the most famous people of the civil rights movement, a woman by the name of Rosa Parks. She was a seamstress, and she worked for the NAACP. And she basically took a seat in the front row of the colored section of a Montgomery bus. But as the bus filled up, the driver ordered Parks and 3 other African American passengers to empty their row so that a white man who didn't have a seat was able to sit down, even though it was in the colored section. Parks refused to give up her seat. The bus driver stopped the bus, pulled it over, waved down a cop, and had her arrested. And Rosa Parks' quote says, "It was time for someone to stand up, or in my case, sit down." So she made a stand, and she was arrested for it. And this is kind of one of those things called the nonviolent protest. All right, and we're going to talk about some of those here in just a second. So some different movements are going to form. We have these 4 different movements. Some are what we call nonviolent, and some are violent. Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE, and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee were both movements that were civil rights movements that were considered nonviolent. They didn't want violent. They did protests and sit-ins and different things like that, but they didn't get involved in violence. Now, a couple of other ones, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference was also a nonviolent. And then you had the Black Panthers. Black Panthers were a little different. They were more on the violent side. They were founded to fight police brutality, and so they did have to fight back. And they were armed, and they were dangerous, and they did fight for freedom. In the 1960s, this is a time where you had sit-ins and abuse of these non-violent civil rights movements in the 1960s. You can see these people trying to sit at a lunch counter whenever they weren't supposed to be, and that was considered a violation of the law, and people attacked them for it, dumped cokes on them and stuff like that. So the Freedom Rides, this was supposed to be a non-violent movement where Northern black and white students rode buses to the South, into the South, to try to integrate the bus stations, to try to force these bus stations to integrate, to get rid of that idea of separate but equal, have everything be equal for everyone. You can see this is a picture of the Black Panther movement. You can see, they have weapons. They were very, very powerful. "We must unite" was one of their slogans. Now let's move towards getting into Texas a little bit. We have the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This is one of our Texas presidents, Lyndon Baines Johnson. Of course, we know he was from Johnson City, and there's a big, huge park, which is known as the Texas White House out there. It'd be a good thing to go look at if you get a chance, if they open up during this coronavirus thing. Go out and look at the park. Go out and look at what Lyndon Johnson did in the Texas White House. But how he became president was he was actually the vice president, and President Kennedy was shot and killed, and so Johnson took over. And so he was responsible for passing this thing called the Civil Rights Act, and it was very much not taken very well in the South, of course, because that's where most of a lot of the segregation and things were still going on. So what the Civil Rights Act said was that there would be no more discrimination based on race, religion, sex, or national origin, where you're from. It gave all citizens the right to enter libraries, parks, washrooms, restaurants, and theaters. And it provided integration on buses. And so that's important. The Civil Rights Act was a huge, huge piece of legislation to get this civil rights movement going. Another really important person in the civil rights movement was Martin Luther King Jr. Martin Luther King was a preacher, and he believed in the nonviolent portion of the civil rights movement, but he does want direct action. He wanted things to happen. One of the things he really fought for was this equality, right? And he was viewed by many as an enemy, and so he was actually assassinated on April 4th, 1968, in Memphis, Tennessee. Sure who shot Martin Luther King. The theory and the idea was he was shot by James Earl Ray. So that's what we're going to go with. That's what most of the history books say. Now, in addition to, we had some more legislation passed called the Civil Rights Act of 1968. This is going in addition to the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This act, or this law, prohibited discrimination concerning the sale, rental, and financing of housing based on race, religion, national origin, or sex. So this created the equal housing opportunity. So anytime you go in to fill out paperwork to buy a house or rent a house, you're going to see that statement on the bottom of the the contract, because they cannot discriminate based on any of those things. Now, another member of the civil rights movement was by the name of Malcolm X. He joined the Nation of Islam as a separatist revolution. He came from up north, but he got involved with Islam, and so he made the trek to Mecca, where whenever he came back, he had kind of a religious experience, a big religious experience, and he favored interracial harmony. He wanted everybody to get along. That was his whole plan. And so even though he was a civil rights leader, he was actually shot by a group called the Black Muslims, who felt that he wasn't going far enough and people didn't like him. In 1961, there was a group called CORE. This is Congress of Racial Equality, led by James Farmer. He's one of the key people that you need to know in this unit, along with some of the other ones that we've talked about. James Farmer. This was a biracial group, so it did have white members. It was nonviolent, but also wanted direct action, very similar to Martin Luther King. They believed in sit-ins and freedom rides and those kind of things. 24th Amendment was passed during this time period that we're talking about, the Civil Rights Movement, and this prohibits both Congress and the states from requiring payments of a poll tax or other types of taxes to vote. So people were able to vote and didn't have to pay anything, and that's a good thing. So it kept everybody was able to vote, no matter of their social standing. Now we're going to move towards Texas a little bit, and there's a couple of things that were involved in this. Sweat versus Painter was a law that was a civil rights case, Supreme Court case that desegregated Texas universities. This was mainly in the University of Texas that it started, but it works for any state university. We also have the Marital Property Act, which said that women received equal rights to community property. Women received responsibility to support their husbands financially, and women received the same rights as men in the custody of children. So, last thing is, people always had a dilemma in dealing with the civil rights movement. And so what I want you to think about now is, which one would you be involved in? Or do you not get involved in at all? Okay, would you be a part of that nonviolent group? Would you be a part of that violent group? Which would you be most willing to fight for, and why? So think about that in your thought processes that you're going through with the civil rights movement. Hope y'all have a good week, and we hope to see you soon. Take care. Coach Willis out.